Good evening, welcome and thank you for joining us for today's webinar on why managing psychosocial hazards is vital for your practice, proudly presented by Practice Hub. Firstly, in the spirit of reconciliation, Practice Hub acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respect to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. Thank you again for joining us for the latest Practice Hub webinar. We have two speakers with us this evening who'll be addressing the questions that have come through during the registration process, for which we thank you. If you have any additional questions about today's topics during the webinar, please enter them into the chat. So our panel this evening is Angela Mason-Lynch. Angela is a risk advisor with Avant and has great experience as a practice manager of many disciplines and sizes. Angela has experience as a board member for multiple bodies in the healthcare system and as an accreditation surveyor, an assessor and trainer for the University of New England, and much more. And I am the other presenter tonight, Anna Maria Gibb. I'm the co-creator of my practice manual, which is now Practice Hub. I have an established background in practice management and qualifications in business and adult education. Just a bit of housekeeping before we start. Everyone will be muted. If you have any questions, please enter them in the chat and we'll go through them as we go through the session this evening. A link to the recording of this webinar will be sent out to all registered attendees, along with a handout listing the resources that are referenced in the presentation. Let's get started. Angela, you're a risk advisor with Avant, so you hear a lot about those issues that become problematic for practices and practitioners. We're hearing more and more about psychosocial hazards. What's causing that and why is it important?
Thanks, Anna Marie. Yes, I'm sure that a lot of us haven't even heard the phrase psychosocial hazards until quite recently when the new law was brought about. And it is clearly problematic for our members because we get a lot of queries at the risk advisory service at Avant on, what are they supposed to be doing and how can we help them do it properly. So the new law came about. Safe Work Australia implemented the new law, which is the national body, but all the states have adopted these laws. So what they are is looking at the workplace safety and how you can do what you're supposed to be doing. I guess to help you understand a little bit more the driver behind psychosocial hazards was, and remember, this is just one driver. There were lots of things that drove this need for new laws. So you may remember the very mediarised case of the senior police officer. She was a woman who had spent many years looking at child pornography as part of her job, and she retired. And following her retirement, she made a claim against her employer for post-traumatic stress. And this was played out in the courts. And what the courts told us basically, and now what Safe Work is telling us, is that it's not okay just to respond to issues that might cause somebody in the workplace to be unsafe. It's about, there's now a responsibility for you as employers to reach out, or managers to reach out, to consult, to collaborate with your people. And it's very much changed the whole narrative from being reactive, which is what we used to always do, to being really proactive in your management of risk. And there's really quite substantial fines, Anna Maria, if you don't do it. And if you could just pop onto the next slide for me, I sort of conceptualize for you what this transition looks like. So it's very much sort of moving from that reactional. So once upon a time, you managed workplace safety by talking about when something went wrong and talking about what you would do so it wouldn't go wrong again. But it's changed now to you seeking out what might go wrong or what might be perceived as a problem in your workplace and doing something about it. And to give you an example of something that happened just recently, is I got contacted by a practice manager and she said, I've got these 2 auditors in my waiting room saying that they're here to do a workplace safety audit. And of course, we advised her to tell them to go away and come back at a time that was, planned. But it was interesting that in this particular case, the receptionist had reported the practice, and the receptionist felt unsafe. So they reported them to Safe Work, and Safe Work said auditors out. So they're really quite serious about this. They will come out and audit you. And I think your people are very aware that it's your responsibility to keep them safe.
So, Angela, I guess this, hopefully and fortunately, in most cases, our practices aren't seeing pornography and things like that. So what kind of examples might we have of where people might feel unsafe in a medical setting?
Yep. So this slide that you've put up here, Anna Maria, is it's something that Safe Work produced, and it gave actual examples of what you need to be thinking about, or some of the things that might stimulate a psychosocial hazard as being identified in your practice. And I've read through these, and when I first saw these, I went, oh my God, like every single one of these could be applied to some of the things that our support staff do on a daily basis. So you can read these yourself, or you can download them from the Safe Work website. But basically, there's a whole list of things, and let's just talk to one of them. Let's say talk to traumatic events. So in your practice, think about if a regular patient who's been coming to the practice for a long time, let's say they pass away. So that could be identified as a traumatic event that you probably should have considered what you're going to do about that, or what you should have done about it, and how you're going to support your people. And that could be really quite traumatic for your receptionist. The other one that we're seeing more and more of at Avant is these aggressive patients. So, the patient that rings up, is abusive on the phone, then turns up at the practice and abuses the staff member. That's a traumatic event, and that's happening really quite common now. That's a very common event. And I guess one of the things that I've seen happen far too often is where the receptionist is dealing with a really angry patient at the desk, and a doctor will come out of their room and take the patient and just do what the patient wants, because it's going to quieten the situation and take them away from, the busy front desk, and protect the receptionist a little bit. But again, that's not a good management of this problem. And in fact, if that's done, that could be perceived as an unsupportive workplace, or poor workplace relations, because the receptionist has kind of been undermined because the patient's got what they want. So we've really got to look at this broadly and think about what could be going wrong in our practice under each of these titles, and get our people to start thinking about it.
Sounds good. And I think you're right, Angela. There is that sense. I see so many comments in forums and that about the aggressive patients. And it really is something that I think, you go home at the end of the day, it could be quite traumatic as well. And how do you need to feel supported there?
One of the really interesting ones on this page are lack of role clarity. I mean, as you know, it's just so busy out there in the practices, and how different can one receptionist role be to another receptionist role? So, and I had a couple of really great examples just recently. So I had a receptionist. She thought she was a really good receptionist, and every time she triaged a patient, she would quickly go on the computer and read the patient's medical record to see if this patient was being honest with her, and to try and work out where this appointment should go. And she thought she was doing a really good job, and the patient found out that the receptionist was doing this and was quite horrified that was occurring. When the receptionist was pulled in and spoken to about this, she said, well, I'm just doing my job. I didn't know that I couldn't do that. I thought that was a really good way for me to work out if this patient was telling the truth and whether they really did need an urgent appointment. And another really great example, and this truly happened. This was a receptionist who was folding the letters and putting them in envelopes for reminders. And she put a husband and wife letter in the same envelope thinking, oh, this will save the practice, a stamp. So yay me, I'm doing a good job. And again, that ended up as a privacy breach claim. And it's all about lacking credibility, isn't it? The husband and the wife went, well, what's this practice coming at? Putting both our letters in one, that's not right, made a complaint. And the receptionist, when she was reprimanded over this and explained, that this wasn't what she should be doing, again, she said, I thought I was saving money, I didn't realize. So this is a really great example of lack of role clarity. And Anna Maria, I know that you're an expert on this. We know that job descriptions and education and ongoing education is so important. And we've seen lots of cases where this has bitten practices on the backsides. So if you were a manager using Practice Hub, what would you be doing about this?
Yeah, so Angela, of course, as you're saying, role clarity, position descriptions. So if I was a manager with using Practice Hub, one of the key things is that people's position descriptions would be accessible, they'd be current, and they'd clearly identify what the expectations were. And I think that's really important. And as you say, does one receptionist position description look the same as everyone else's? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. Maybe sometimes people have specific tasks that they are responsible for in that role, and that should be reflected in their position description. I think it's also really important to review the policies that are relevant to their role. Involve those people in the review, and often, getting people to read policies or procedures and processes, they'll come back and go, but we don't do it like that. That's not how we do it. And it's really important, because when those things are written, sometimes you're not thinking of every sort of situation, every scenario that could apply. So that's really important to do. Have regular meetings with standing items in the agenda for risks and hazards. So you start to develop, I think, encourages that culture of people speaking out. It's not like, oh my goodness, we've identified a risk, do we speak out or not? But it's really more a case of this is part of our culture, see something, say something, so they feel comfortable. Try and be proactive. So, and that was in the earlier slide that we had, be proactive and preempt what could happen and have policies in place for that. So recently I heard about a receptionist that gave out a doctor's personal mobile phone number to a patient, and another where staff were upset because their leave wasn't approved. In Practice Hub, we've got policies around authorised use of contacts. So again, it's clearly obvious that you do not give out the doctor's mobile number. Again, probably like some of the scenarios Angela raised, people think they're being helpful, but it just is not the way you would like things done. And then, of course, the leave policy that specifically calls out that we can't approve leave unless the practice can still be resourced appropriately. We can't have the entire front desk taking off a week either side of Easter. So those sorts of policies in place makes it really easier to mitigate those risks. Angela, a really interesting one, and one that we had a good response on, I think, with our questions at registration. It was poor organisational justice. What does that actually mean?
I was really impressed to see this one included on psychosocial hazards, because I have thought for many years this is a real problem. This is that, the squeaky gate that gets all the oil, the poor performing staff member that everybody works around because, they just don't want the problem, or, the manager just goes, oh yeah, that's just her, you know what it's like, or that's just him, we just work around it. The staff members that don't want to work with that particular staff member because they're poor performers. So poor organisational justice is when those poor performers aren't managed properly. And you know what? Poor performers are absolutely demoralising, and managers out there, if you are letting your poor performers continue to perform badly, all you're going to do is drag the high performers down to that level as well. I always say you have to put your big boy pants on and manage these people, and manage them carefully and properly, because now with this psychosocial hazard, your other staff members can claim that justice is not being adopted correctly in the practice. So put your big boy pants on, muscle up, and manage your poor performers, and make sure you do it properly. You might need to get help with that too, because I know it can be really tricky. How would you manage it with Practice Hub, Anna Maria?
Look, I would manage it with, again, policies and procedures, so you can demonstrate to people how an activity or how a process should be done. You can review the specifics with the team member who might not be performing as you would expect or doing their role adequately. You can discuss how you can manage their performance without being challenged as a bully. And have relevant HR policies, including ones that do relate to performance management, investigation, and disciplinary procedures. So if all those things are clearly documented and followed, you're kind of making life a lot easier for yourself when you're in these situations.
Yeah.
So, Angela, on the good news front, how can we do positive things to manage psychosocial hazards?
Yeah. Look, the Institute for Healthcare Improvement published a really great set of, I call them, I reckon it's our mantra. So if you can skip on to the next slide for me, Anna Maria. I love this. And I think that if managers could live with this mantra for their team, then they're going to be covering off the psychosocial hazards. So what the Healthcare Improvement Institute say is your staff should feel like, or your team should feel like, they're being heard, that you are hearing them, that you're protecting them, that you're caring for them, that you're preparing them, and that you're supporting them. So if we go back to, a regular patient dying, what could you do to be caring for them in that scenario? What might you do? You might have a debriefing, or you might have, you might be discussing regularly with your team if there's anything that's worrying them about the patients that are coming through, and you will know if there's a patient that is critically ill in your practice. What we see very often that causes a claim to be raised is when a significant change is made to the way that you do things in your practice, but the information from all the relevant people is not sought. So what you see is, say a principal comes into the practice manager and says, okay, I've got these problems now with SafeScript. We're not going to prescribe drugs of addiction anymore for this practice. So just tell the staff to ask the question and don't book anybody in. And the practice manager goes, all right, my principal's told me that, I'm just going to go and tell the staff that they're not allowed to do that anymore. So they just have to ask the question and not book patients in. So this is what we would call another one of these psychosocial hazards, which is poor organisational change management. So, something significant has changed that's going to cause problems for your support staff, but were they involved in how you might implement this change? Another really great example is, okay, we're not going to write scripts anymore for patients unless they come and have a consult. So just do it, staff. And all of a sudden we've got this lack of, change management again. So what we really want to see is that the relative people, which are all your support staff, have the opportunity to collaborate with you on how this change might look. Anna Maria, can we just go back to the angry patient scenario? We know this is so common, and we know that this would be identified as a hazard on our risk assessment. What are some of the tools in Practice Hub that will help the practices care for their people or support their people?
Yep. No, good question, Angela. So I did have this up before, and I'll go back to it. So we do have, for example, a violence in the workplace policy. We also have policies around things like how to end the doctor-patient relationship, that there's a process if that's what the practice wants to do. In Practice Hub, we'd be recording our meeting minutes so they reflect the discussions that we've had, actions that we've agreed to as a team. And so that all of these things in turn reflect the practice's desire to care, protect, and support the team. I think the other thing that it's worth highlighting here is with something like Practice Hub, we've also got this ability to get people to sign off. So I know sometimes people will say, oh, I didn't know about that, or nobody told me, or I couldn't find that information. Within Practice Hub, you've got these policies. but they're no good if nobody knows they're there. And you as managers and practice owners, you need a sort of evidence that you have provided that information to your team and you have gone through it. So having that ability, and you can see with the red banners top and bottom of the page there, of getting individuals to go in and confirm that they have read and understood those policies. So, you know, if somebody says, but there's no health and wellbeing, or there's no support, or I don't know how to end, you know, how am I supposed to ask these questions? You can go back and say, well, we have this information, you can look it up at any time, but we also have evidence that you have read it and you have signed off on it as well. And, you know, this particular one talks about, you know, providing advice, support and assistance to staff when dealing with violence that's occurred in the workplace, so that you are committed to doing that as well.
Thanks, Anna Maria.
Angela, you're going to talk about risk assessment, one of my favorite topics.
I will, because what we're seeing, and this has definitely been sort of a rollout from COVID, but when something goes wrong, one of the pieces of evidence that we like to have so that we can respond on your behalf is a risk assessment. Like, we love your policies and procedures. We love to see that you've trained your staff. We love to see that you've consulted with your people. But risk assessments are a really succinct way of keeping it all in one document. For example, that staff member that rang Safe Work and said they felt that the practice wasn't protecting them, and the auditors went out, the first thing they're going to ask for when they do that audit is, let me see your risk assessment for psychosocial hazards in the workplace. So everybody here on this webinar should be very familiar with the word risk assessment, or the words risk assessment. We had to do it for COVID. Now we really have to do it under Safe Work as well. So your COVID risk assessment would sit in your Safe Work risk assessment. They can be one document, that's fine, but maybe just separated, you know, within the document. So the same thought processes apply for a work health and safety risk assessment as what applied for your COVID risk assessment, which is identifying what the risks are for your practice, getting other people to help you identify what they might be, getting everybody in the workplace to think about, to brainstorm some ideas about how they can alleviate, either get rid of or make that psychosocial hazard more acceptable, you know, or less detrimental, if you like. Now, look, risk assessments, just like with COVID, there is a whole lot of templates out there. I love this one. It's actually the Queensland Government Safe Work assessment template, but I've noticed a lot of bodies point to this as a really great option for getting, you know, a template and then tailoring it to your practice. So, Anna Maria, what's in Practice Hub to help practices with their risk assessment?
Yeah, so we have some register templates, and can I just point out at this stage, we will send links to people after the webinar to these resources, so don't stress. But yes, I love this Queensland one as well. So what we have in Practice Hub, we have some templates for risk registers. They don't need to be overly complex. So you can see we've got one there for the organisation-wide risk, and we break that up into business risk, clinical and safety risks, because I think, you know, it's nice to be able to group these things. The ones we're talking about today would probably be down in the safety risks. And then there's a breakdown of those things. So there would be psychosocial risks as part of that as well. And I think the main thing here, if there's one thing I could highlight, it's about doing these things regularly and making them collaborative. So you can see there that I've done the review frequency of this to be once every month. So once a month, Practice Hub will prompt me to go in and just update that register. And then when you're doing that, if you're having monthly practice meetings, then you can use some of the content of the risks you've identified during the course of the month to talk through at the practice meeting, which in turn generates the minutes and actions from those discussions as well. So, you know, and just using things like the inbuilt messages application to remind people if they've identified risks and they need to report them as well.
Anna Maria, something we have noticed at Avant is when we ask for these pieces of evidence to respond to a regulatory body, the practice will give us their current risk register, and it's sometimes not relevant to the complaint because the complaint might be 3 months old. And as you know, that's a really big issue if there's been a substantial change to the practice or the laws in that 3 months. So how does Practice Hub manage?
Yes, so you can see the examples there. I've got 2023. So if it were, me running the practice using this, every year I would start a new risk register and still be able to access the previous years. So you can see that trend of, what risks were identified going back for longer than just the current year or the current months as well. So you've got that sort of audit trail of the things that you've reported. Angela, we've got 3 minutes. Do you have any last minute top tips or things that you'd want to tell our audience tonight?
That slide that we showed, that Safe Work actually outline all the things that could be psychosocial hazards. I probably don't recommend you use that as, you need to use it as a guide when you're doing your risk assessment and thinking about what's going on. But I think it's more important that you build this culture with your people that you care about them and let them come to you with complaints so that then you can put them under those headings rather than put the headings out to your staff and go, here you go, here's all the psychosocial hazards, list what you think they are for you. I don't think that works as well. And these have been trialled now for, we're going on 8 months now that practices started really doing these. And I think what seems to work best is if you as the managers keep these lists of psychosocial hazards, but you say to your team, okay, I want to care for you and create that culture of caring. So tell me how I can care for you better with what you're doing in your job. Tell me what's upsetting you. Tell me what you don't like at the end of the day. Tell me what's made your work today not enjoyable. I think it's all about creating that culture of care and support. And remember that, hear me, protect me, care for me, prepare me and support me. Make it your mantra.
Yes. And as I said earlier, we'll send a link to this, but I particularly, like you, I particularly love this resource. And when you do get the link, please have a look, because one of the things I like is it's so practical and it has like conversation starters. So what's the kind of phrasing you want to use when you're asking people, how can I protect you? What can we do to care for you? It actually gives you some sort of wording and as I say, conversation starters, which I think makes it a really practical tool and very easy to use and to keep using as well.
Yep.
All right, well, I will do the quick wrap up. I hope you have found this really useful. Thank you for joining us this evening. A recording of the webinar will be sent out to you next week, along with details of our next webinar. There is a survey at the end of this webinar. Please complete it if you have a moment. We really do value your feedback, in particular your suggestions for topics that you would like us to cover in the future. On that note, I'll wish you a good evening and look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.